Hello and welcome to the fourth instalment of Society Language Difference. So this week we're going to look at Frantz Fanon. Now Fanon is not conventionally seen as a philosopher. He's often placed within a post-colonial context of third worldist revolutionaries who are challenging European hegemony and were overthrowing the French and various colonial orders. And this is a very important way of seeing him, and it's his context. But my argument and my challenge over the next hour or so is that we need to think about Frantz Fanon as a philosopher. We need to see him as somebody who is putting many of the emerging brew of exciting ideas about God, about mankind, about our purpose, our freedom, and our responsibility to confront tyranny and inequality into practice. He's somebody who, above all, is exercising the kind of demands for liberation and freedom that we have seen so far with Foucault and others, and that we will see again. So that's the challenge. I also think that Fanon is one of the most interesting and fascinating thinkers on this course, but because of his relatively short life, somebody who we do not know what great theories and what great work he would have continued to produce in the 1960s had he not died an untimely death of leukemia. A very talented man, writes philosophy, an active psychotherapist, makes a number of innovations in mental health, also writes plays, is a kind of politician, an intriguing figure, an intriguing man. A very good Netflix biopic awaits on this figure. Over the next hour or so, let's take a look at his life. So this is our agenda. We're going to meet Frantz Fanon, first of all. I want you to kind of know a bit about him. And then we're going to look at one of his earlier works, an important work, Black Skin, White Masks. And then we're going to start looking at his turn to colonialism. Now, we're not just going to look at this in a historical perspective. We're going to look at his arguments about how colonialism, and by implication any form of oppressive power, how it works and operates through language, and how it manages to operate also on the mind, in producing feelings of collective self-hatred and shame and inferiority. He therefore sees colonial liberation, national liberation, as like a form of therapy, as a liberation that isn't just about changing the government. It isn't just about, having a local dialects and local languages as the official language. It's way more than that. It's about how people are capable of thinking and how we think together in different ways, how the mind can be colonized and how we fight back. That's the bulk of what we're going to talk about, and then we're going to think about the legacies of Frantz Fanon, which are quite mixed and interesting. Anyway, let's land straight in the middle from the man himself. This is a quote from The Wretched of the Earth. And this line gives us a sense of how his project for colonial liberation is one that is couched in the terms of autonomy and freedom that we would associate with the philosophers that we're looking at, who are fighting and resisting fascism, the conditions of fascism after the Second World War. Fanon, quote, "No leader, however valuable he may be, can substitute himself for the popular will. And the national government ought first to give back their dignity to all citizens, fill their minds and feast their eyes with human things, and create a prospect that is human because conscious and sovereign men dwell therein." So that's the aim. It's not just a utilitarian aim to feed bellies. It's not just about distraction. It's not just bread and circuses. It's not just about one great figure like a Martin Luther King type figure. It's something much broader. It's about human beings becoming conscious, becoming powerful, and this reflecting an underlying egalitarianism. Now, this stuff in this time and since is very radical. The New York Review of Books talks about The Wretched of the Earth in 1966 and describes Fanon as a black Rousseau. Now, that's not just because of his kind of, philosophical bent. It's because the unrelenting calls to a justified, it argues that it's justified violence, as though that's what the general will and popular will, but the violent need to overthrow the existing social order and constitute a new one in its place. The reviewer says his call for national revolutions is Jacobin in method, Rousseauist in spirit, and Sartrean in language, altogether as French can be. Maybe from an American perspective here, but this is somebody whose thinking is operating against French culture too. Yes, he writes in French, the colonial tongue, but his work is fighting against the French Empire, fighting against French racism, fighting against oppressive white French structures of thought. There might be some things that are quite French about this guy, but there are others that are very different. So, let's meet Fanon. Let's think about Fanon's world. So, Frantz Fanon is born in 1925 in Martinique, and Martinique is in the Caribbean, it's in the West Indies, and it's a French colony. His family are neither poor nor rich, they're middle class. His mother is a shop owner, his father is a customs inspector. But even though they have a middle class life, they don't go hungry, and Fanon is able to, they can afford the fees so they can go to the best school on the island. They still experience, degrees of kind of hardship and so on. Some of Fanon's siblings, he's one of 8 children, die when he's quite young. And I guess more than that, even to be black and middle class in Martinique still isn't a position of total kind of security and equality, because you are living under an imperial regime which is premised on racist ideas of inferiority and superiority. And this is what Fanon encounters. It reflects partly the world of empires, and the carve up in particular of Africa, but of many other parts of the world by the Western European powers over the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century. Now in Britain, we're kind of aware of this, usually in quite in a depressingly glorifying way, of having an empire of pink bits all over the map where the sun never set. I think sometimes we're not often aware enough, not that I suppose it matters that much, but that France also had a very extensive empire at different points. Think about French-speaking Canada and so on. Or during the time of Napoleon, how the French briefly overrun most of Europe. But the main part is in Central and Western Africa. You can kind of see it on this map here. Regions where people still speak French extensively today. Now you might need to squint, but Martinique is also an important part of that as well. See that in the Caribbean, you've got this little line of small islands. Now Fanon grows up in Martinique. When he's at that top high school, he studies under Aimé Césaire, who ends up becoming a communist politician, but he's an anti-colonial theorist of liberation, also a poet. And Aimé Césaire inspires Fanon as well to kind of think critically about colonialism, ends up being a friend. Now Fanon, born in 1925, grows up in a small colonized Caribbean island, which is structurally underdeveloped, it's quite poor. But then what happens is during the Second World War, again the Second World War, conditions and shapes so many of our thinkers on this course. What's happening in Martinique? Well, in Martinique, the island has got a large naval base, and what happens is that when France becomes occupied, you have the Vichy collaboration regime in southern France, and in the end that gets overrun too by the Nazis. But the navy there, the sailors there, are all supporters of the Vichy regime, and what they decide to do, they're kind of stuck, like they're blockaded on the island of Martinique. They overthrow the government of Martinique, and then they kind of establish an even more openly racist Vichy government. And so Fanon, when he's born in 25, this is 39, 40, 41, he's 15, 16, 17. He's seeing an aggressively colonialist, racist government take over his island. War has disrupted so much. And so his plan, is to escape. Here's some more colonialism and the carve up of Africa. The scramble for Africa, it's sometimes called. It's almost, I would encourage you to instead see it as a collective agreement among the European powers to conquer Africa, like collectively. Like Europe conquers Africa in the late 19th century, and this is what results. Largely underdevelopment, bloodshed, and genocide. It's a fucking disaster. Now, Fanon. Here are some of the facts that I went through. So Fanon decides, while his island is occupied, that he's going to volunteer in the French army. Not the Vichy army, because they've kind of been defeated because the Nazis have overrun France, and they are like a minority, like a reactionary fascist minority. What Fanon instead decides to do is to fight with the Free French. Now, this is the upper French government in exile, people like Charles de Gaulle, and there is a significant Free French armed force, and Fanon volunteers to fight in it. So as a result, Fanon ends up kind of seeing a lot of military combat. He leaves Martinique in 1943, he's at age 18, and then he fights in various battles. He fights in the Battle of Alsace, and he receives a Croix de Guerre at Colmar. So he's somebody who kind of experiences military battles in different ways, but what he encounters a lot and what he writes about a lot is racism in Europe. Of the ways in which he was subject to racist abuse, but even indirectly the ways in which people would look upon him because of the colour of his skin as being inferior. Even though, as far as he's concerned, he was fighting for the French. He was a Frenchman fighting for the French. That was what his colonial education had given him. Why should he be seen as inferior or different? Now look at that photo in front of you. In this image, you've got some black soldiers, and then to the left and right, you have, well, I guess, like white soldiers, and mixture with some white workers too. And we can see by the facial expressions of the black soldiers that something unpleasant is happening. One of them looks on the right very suspiciously at the camera. We have another kind of in the centre who seems to be answering some kind of comment. Enough looks at him. I would guess here that they've been abused in some way. There is some kind of disagreement. But we look at the guy in the centre and the dignity of his posture. Now, Frantz Fanon talks a lot about the racism that he encountered in Europe. One of the things that he mentions is that when they were liberating Italy, the women, in the villages and towns, preferred to kind of dance with the fascist prisoners of war than to go near the dark-skinned Frenchmen. That they were kind of, they were seen as lower than low. This also happens more prominently in something that I mentioned in the first class, in the liberation of Paris in 1945. That even though the French, like the British, had very much depended on huge numbers of colonial soldiers, of non-white soldiers, in order to kind of help them stay in the war. By the very end, there's a PR campaign to airbrush this out of history. So when the very stage-managed liberation of Paris occurs, the Nazi soldiers have left, the generals have made it clear that only white soldiers can take part. So Fanon's regiment and others are not allowed to take part. They cannot be seen liberating Paris because this is a war that's been won by white Europeans. That's not true. It's not true at all. But that's the story, and that in itself reflects the kind of structural and embedded racism that exists at the level of language and that exists at the level of culture that Fanon was trying to talk about and discuss. And it's this, now we're probably thinking here immediately of links of Fanon with, say, Foucault or with the Frankfurt School. That power operates at the level of ideas, of language, of ideology, of culture, popular culture. That if we're going to deal with racism, we don't need to, the goal shouldn't be to critique somebody who's scientifically racist or eugenical in some way. The goal is to look at how everyday culture reflects and reinforces subtle codes of racism, how it communicates ways that establish that some are inferior and some are superior. How does that work? That's what Fanon is trying to get to. Okay, so that's Fanon's wartime experience. At the end of the Second World War, he decides that he goes back to Martinique and he tries to help his friend Aimé Césaire get elected as a communist, and so on. But then he decides to go back to France again, and he studies in France. He studies at Lyon. Now it's interesting, given that in his later career is working as a psychiatrist in Algeria. It's interesting that what he studies isn't anything related to psychiatry. It's literature and philosophy. This is what he's doing as a young man, and he's writing plays. He writes a number of plays. They've been published posthumously. It's only a bit later that he goes into psychiatry, and he qualifies as a psychiatrist in 1951. Something that I briefly mentioned, I think, in the first class or the second class, was that if you were to study philosophy in France up until the mid-1960s, in order to pass and get a teaching qualification, you had to train in one of the sciences, hard science, soft science. But so that would therefore include something like medicine, or it could include even like a physical science in some way. So it's not completely unheard of that somebody interested in philosophy would end up studying a kind of medical discipline. But this is what Fanon really goes into, really applies himself to. So quite quickly he ends up getting a job at a hospital in Algeria, the Blida Joinville Psychiatric Hospital. He's heading it in 1953. And what's interesting about it is that his Algeria years and experience. So if we think he's there from 53 until 61, which is when he dies, is that he's not just treating Algerians. He's treating French as well, and the French soldiers and the local white French colonizers. People that in some cases have been living there for many generations. The pied noir literally means black foot. Black, all of these people in different ways and different forms have been traumatized by colonialism. And he is treating it not as some, abstract kind of wounds of social injustice. He's dealing with people that who are mentally unwell in very real ways, in such a way that they have to be hospitalized. So he's there from 53. The Algerian War of Independence erupts in 1954. Maybe that's another thing that is different from that separates the French experience of colonialism and decolonization from, say, the British. But think about the partition of India. That the British decided in most cases that they're not going to make any concerted effort to hold on to their colonial claims after the Second World War. They kind of surrendered, and they allow places to regain their independence without that much of a struggle. Some places are an exception, like Kenya. Whereas in France, think about Indochina, what becomes the Vietnam War, or Algeria, there's a concerted, very violent struggle. This has a big bearing on French politics. So the war breaks out in 1954, and then what happens is, he had been working as a psychotherapist, and he kind of is still very interested in his work, but from 1957, he's doing a lot of work for the Front de Liberation Nationale, the National Liberation Front, I guess, which is the movement for an independent Algeria, independent from colonial rule. And he does all sorts of stuff for them. He's become a journalist, he's editing a publication, he's suggesting what their next move should be, he represents them overseas. And that's how we want to contextualize the Wretched of the Earth, which I've asked you to look at for this week. That it's something that is trying to publicize and justify what the FLN are doing. Their reason for it, taking up and embracing violent tactics. Also, you wanted to keep in mind about the book that he doesn't write it in a conventional way. He's dictating the book. This kind of explains the sort of weird structure, especially towards the end. He's dictating it to his wife in bed. He's dying from leukemia in his last year or two. He has a very slow and painful death. And at first, really doesn't want to... he's very worried about being treated, even though the United States has got the best hospitals at this time, still does. He doesn't want to be treated in an American hospital because he's worried he's going to get assassinated, and so he leaves it until very late before he gets treated. It's too late, and that's the kind of the untimeliness of his death. Really, 1961. It's not a long life. So some key dates in his short life, really. So we can call it 10 years of intellectual activity. Starts studying Lyon, 51. Black Skin, White Martyr, we're going to talk about it in a second, 1952. Algeria, the revolutionary stuff in 57, 59. Some of this stuff has been published subsequently, like the essay collection Toward the African Revolution, Wretched of the Earth. And And then in terms of events, so the Wretched of the Earth, I guess it's dictated in 1960, comes out in 1961. 1961, there's a huge protest in Paris of Algerians in favour of independence. Many are massacred by the police, but we don't know how many. Could be up to 200. But then Algeria gains complete independence in 1962. And it all ends happily ever after, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. And we'll talk about that too in the legacies further along. Okay, before we get into Black Skin White Mars, let's just kind of make some broader comments about what Fanon is trying to do. So he's somebody who is, in his own way, has some important connections with the top echelons of French intellectual life. Well, here I'm thinking of the preface to this book by Sartre that we'll talk about in a moment. And he writes a lot of really interesting things that have been systematically published only fairly recently in English. Jean Calfa is often the translator. There's a big series of these books of Bloomsbury. I want to just make some contrast here, Fanon with Foucault actually. Just because we were looking at Foucault last week, and there's an interesting connection there about their understanding of madness and psychiatry. So let's think about Foucault. We were looking at madness and civilization last week, and we were thinking about what madness means, and how madness is something that is defined by those who are kind of ejecting it, the rational, reasonable order, who are themselves a social order. And when Foucault is talking about the history of madness, he makes a lot out of moments like what he calls the Great Confinement, in which many of the mad were locked up. They were on the streets of Paris. The logic, it seems, for identifying and locking them up was because they were not economically productive, and that therefore reflects a bourgeois morality of work. What's that got to do with Fanon? Well, it's a sense of understanding how power works through language, through how something is defined as mad or unreasonable, as abject, as inferior, as black and not white. We're not just dealing with the physical, material forms of repression, say the shackles in which a mad person was chained up, or the cells in which they were locked in. We're dealing with the forms of diagnosis and medical expertise in which discourses are developed, in which some can call others mad, and how that works, or how some can deem others as inferior, as racially inferior. What it reflects is a kind of influence of phenomenology. I'll say more about this in a moment, of trying to not just look at things on the surface, but look at how our experiences are structured in certain ways, structured by language and so forth. Fanon, like Foucault, is really interested in how power is mentally internalized, and how power isn't just something that is necessarily just done to us, where we are disempowered and someone else is powerful. Power instead is something that we internalize, so that we can end up communicating and perpetuating attitudes and ideas that harm us or harm others. But we can perpetuate racism, even in an indirect way. We can develop kind of something that ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of failure. Let's say if we are a primary school teacher and we think that some children of certain communities or ethnicities are only good at certain things. Power isn't then something that is about the kind of the physical force of authority. It's something that exists in terms of norms, values, dispositions. So there's all that. Okay, I know that's quite philosophically dense. There's also just the fact that Foucault and Fanon have a direct connection and understanding of psychiatry. They're both very interested in it. Neither of them think that we should look at psychology as something that's simply just reduced to our bodies or our biology. Nor do they think that neurosis can be entirely explained by infant sexuality, which is the premise of Freud and psychoanalysis, which is hugely influential in this time. Instead, we need to look at how madness arises, sometimes deliberately, out of the social fabric in which some strive to be more powerful than others. We need to therefore deal with those perceptions, deal with that language. And in turn, and this is a very tantalizing point, to maybe even see that there's something about liberation which is mad. Madness might be a form of liberation. So these are some commonalities. Just briefly about the influence of phenomenology. I know we've Maurice Merleau-Ponty has come up a couple of times on this course. I've not wanted to spend that much time on structuralism, but hopefully I've given you some useful bits so far. We want to think of it as something that emerges from the mid-1940s into the 1950s. Merleau-Ponty is one key figure. That guy there. It's French philosophy. Somebody's got to be smoking. We haven't had much smoking so far. But also Claude Lévi-Strauss as well. Now, what are our phenomenologists really interested in? Well, they're influenced by a guy called Edmund Husserl. We met him, I think, last week. And they're interested in how, well, they're very interested in language and linguistics. And in the study of language, at least in the early mid-20th century, lots of people had observed that there were these universal structures to language. Like, you have a thing, and then you have a name for a thing. You have a signifier, the name, and then you have the thing itself, the signified. What does all that mean? And if language has a universal structure, and language is what structures thought, then maybe we could use the structures of language to understand thought. That means language is our gateway to understanding experience. Merleau-Ponty, quote, "In the use of our body and our senses, insofar as they involve us in the world, we have the means of understanding our cultural gesticulation, insofar as it involves us in history." Our body, our senses, what we perceive, let's bring that up. Phenomenology is about trying to look at what we, the subject, the self, experiences in here and now, and to begin with that and to explain that. To understand what it means to be in our body or to sense, we also need to think about how the mind structures that experience and makes sense of it. And those structures can change over time. They can have a lot of cultural and political baggage. I guess that's what Merleau-Ponty is trying to get to, the sense of there being a universal structure. Now, we looked at some possible limitations of that last week with Foucault. Can we always assume that the self is the same in every place and time? Maybe not. Is yourself the same as Camus' self in the 1940s? Are we dealing with a kind of a universal tabula rasa, blank slate that observes and experiences everything the same way? Maybe not. That kind of proposes a very abstract kind of faculty within us, which seems to kind of overlook how politics and society or religious ideas shape that in different ways. What if that self is a soul? What if this self that we occupy and inhabit is something that we believe has been reincarnated from any previous selves? Or what if we just think it's a flash in the pan moment of chance? The problem in the end was that although people like Foucault and Fanon thought that Merleau-Ponty was really onto something quite important in terms of understanding the structures of language and selfhood, there can be no simple universal perspective on this. We need to look at how power, how racism, how violence can shape, distort, make, unmake structures in different ways. That's what we need to get to. The goal isn't just to get from Descartes to Hegel. The goal is human freedom. And that has to be much broader. This is the project of Fanon's kind of first major work, Black Skin, White Masks. So let's talk about this. Okay, this isn't from Fanon. This is some front covers of a popular magazine in France at the time that Roland Barthes analyzes in his work Mythologies, which is great. It's quite readable. And he talks about, just as we look at the anthropologists might visit the Amazon and look at the unusual gods and totems there and make all sorts of generalizations about their culture, we should do the same thing with popular culture in 1950s France. There are actually images like this. Let's see if we get the one on the right, the child soldier could communicate. They do communicate kind of subtle, subtle codes about the rest of the world, about white, racial superiority in terms of, peaceful, orderly, non-corrupt societies or not. How these different images are, in their own ways, as sophisticated as the, the strange Earth origin stories, to be found deep in the Amazon basin. But we shouldn't necessarily look upon them as all benign. They have within them powerful codes which communicate inferiority. That's what Fanon is trying to get to in this work. Black skin, white mask. What's he trying to do? Well, this work, I guess, basically is a response to colonialism. It's a revolt against colonialism. But rather than say just focusing on how colonialism is sort of morally unjust, or maybe using Thomas Paine or somebody to talk about the value of national liberation, it's not just about a kind of political freedom where to choose government. It's about how power operates psychologically, and it's about how colonialism operates psychologically, and how colonialism works because it makes the colonized feel inferior. How it makes the colonized want to become white, to have black skin, but to wish to or to need to adopt a white mask, to be white, to want to become French and not from Martinique, to want to be French and not Algerian. That's what this book is trying to do. So we're not just talking about colonization in terms of boots on the ground or control of the capital city. It's about colonization as something that exists at the level of thought and language. What do we mean by that? Well, we're already sensing here that the structuralist baggage, basically the influence, this interest in how language reflects power. Remember, our course is called Society, Language, Difference. We're interested in how language encodes and puts across power. So here we're thinking about what constitutes civilization and what constitutes backwardness or barbarism. Now the book is looking at this. It's how it's not necessarily about how, let's say, the white French, produced these newspapers that were full of, like racist propaganda about how black people were bad. It's not about that. It's much more subtle. It's much more insidious. It's about a kind of a slowly established belief that the indigenous or local culture is bad, is backwards. That languages should be abandoned. The mother tongue of their mother empire, the metropole, is the one that should be adopted. A kind of a distaste for local religious beliefs and so on. So maybe this is what makes colonialism so powerful, that it isn't just about trying to control the government. It's a deeper control of people's minds in such a way that the person who is controlled or who is enslaved wants to be like the master, wants to put on their mask, wants to speak their language, wants to speak their values, and in the process become completely alienated from their own. Now Fanon is writing about France, but we can imagine this, applying to any place that has been colonized by somewhere else from a distant part of the world. So on the map in front of you, this is the greatest extent of the European empires, I think, in history. 1938, UK or France, and the control that they have over Africa in particular. I'm not going to think of the Caribbean as well, or say the British in India. What's the effect of this? What's the effect over generations of control? Well, we see in this image here a white man being kind of carried in a sort of sedan by 4 kind of slave-like figures, 4 black African figures. They're in a state of relative undress. He is dressed in very formal, smart clothing, and that's part of how civilized the claims, the gestures of civilization are put across. We see this too in this image of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, very important figure, kind of now too embarrassing to mention in British history. Major diamond magnate, really decisive in the British colonization of southern Africa. Rhodesia, Rhodes, Zimbabwe. Cecil Rhodes, you might know about the campaign Rhodes Must Fall, the campaign to pull down Cecil Rhodes' statue in Oxford University. Cecil Rhodes was an open and avowed racist. He believed in, white brotherhood and that, white Britons had a right to conquer all of Africa. Now those attitudes are managed in this image here, which is, we can see all the kind of, we can see what's the construction of civilization, the artifice of civilization here, in the way that the black figures on the right are naked and unclothed, whereas those on the left stand purposeful and clothed in different ways. They're bringing industry. This is an uncivilized state of nature, and here they come bringing civilization. The locals should be grateful that civilization has been brought to them. This is just a visual image of what Fanon is trying to sketch out about how white colonizers controlled most effectively through culture, through language, through psychology, through presenting themselves and their culture as superior, and by systematically trying to erase sources of local pride or local strength that existed there. This is very important in the way that you see this with the British in Ireland, you saw it in India, in the ways in which they sabotaged and dispersed education systems, how they insisted on speaking the mother tongue, speaking English in different ways, forcing the place that they colonized to buy in Western imports, and so Western culture, Western ideas become hegemonic. They become the norm. They become what is right and good and proper. And of course, we see this today, not just in the extent of English, but in terms of Western dress, Western culture. You might want to think about missionaries and missionary movements across Africa, which has had a big, vast influence today. So what does Fanon make of this? Let's just hear a little bit from the text itself. Quote, "The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. The Negro enslaved by his inferiority, the white man enslaved by his superiority alike behave in accordance with a neurotic orientation. The black man wants to be white. The white man slaves to reach a human level." There's a lot going off in these remarks, isn't there? We'll see something that's a little bit dense, but I'll try and fill out a bit later on, which is this idea that the master and slave exist in one relationship to each other. That both, after Hegel, are looking for a form of recognition, but the white enslaver is never going to gain this. In fact, and it's quite provocative what Fanon is doing here, he says that the white man slaves to reach a human level. He is a slave of his desire to be recognized as human, but he acts in an inhuman way and therefore invalidates the possibility of being human. That's why ultimately what Fanon is talking about in things like the Wretched Earth isn't just liberation for Algerians, it's liberation for everybody in Algeria by eliminating this harmful relationship in which some are dehumanized and others act in an inhuman way through dehumanizing them. That's what he's trying to do. I'll just give you a different analogy. Some of you might know his book, The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon. Written, it's about 1950s London, written in its kind of like generic Caribbean patois dialect. And that's about it's about the boys. It's about a group of migrants from different parts of the West Indies who've settled in central London. They're doing kind of very low-paying jobs. Many of them have got skills from where they come from, but they have been denied, access to equal employment because the local people, view them as inferior. What's interesting about Lonely London is that the racism there isn't direct; it's indirect. There's no colour bar, as it was called back then. It was illegal to well, not actually illegal, but there was nothing that said that people could get away with refusing housing someone because of the colour of their skin. It's just that in practice, there was a lot of segregation in terms of housing. Lots of landlords didn't want to rent to black people, and there was a lot of discrimination by employers in practice, not officially, against black people. Now, our lonely Londoners are these West Indian men who are sort of denied equal status and are made to feel inferior. But it's not always a melancholic book. It's about how the boys get together at one of the characters' houses and they kind of establish a life for themselves. It's around kind of going out with girls and having a good time. But there is an interesting moment for one of the characters in this book, which is something that also happens in Frantz Fanon's life. This is the character of Galahad, who's this sort of like buccaneering young man who comes to London, and he's very buoyant, and he's ready to take over the world. But one day when he's kind of walking around central London, a little girl kind of points out his black skin and is scared and crying and is shocked. And suddenly Galahad becomes aware of his own black skin in the way in which it provokes kind of disgust and revulsion in a child. It's shocking. How could a child have such a hostile attitude unless it reflects the attitudes of the parents, if not the wider society? The same thing happens to Fanon. His black skin being pointed out by a child, being kind of made to feel inferior in this really deep way. And what Galahad does in the book is he blames his black skin. He says it's his blackness that causes this. Why can't he not be black? That in a subtle way. It's a similar thing to what black skin white moss is trying to do. Or inferiority is something that's encoded on a pigmentation of skin. It doesn't matter about the pigment of your skin, but it does because the skin represents something. It represents inferiority. It represents certain characteristics that mean that some people are deprived access to good jobs or good housing, and others are given the right to feel superior or native. What do we do with that? Well, in a deeper way, what we're talking about here is part 3, which is the colonization of the mind. Now, what I want to do in this part is I want us to start looking at Fanon's writings about psychiatry as they apply to North Africa. And we're going to start getting a taste here of Fanon's psychiatry, what he's trying to do, what he's offering. And part of it comes up in this interesting moment in Black Skin, White Masks, where he is presenting 2 different viewpoints about psychiatry. One is this kind of classic psychoanalyst view that it all comes down to some neurosis that is that reflects your earliest childhood, and the best thing that you can do is accept it. That the individual is to blame for neurosis or psychosis. It's your maladjustment in some way. But Fanon is different, and it's quite refreshing what he says. He says, no, it's not you. It's your society. It's the environment that made you ill. Let's hear him in action. This is Black Skin, White Moss. And I'll just explain one thing as we go along. If I were an Adlerian, so Adler, an important proponent of psychoanalysis, if I were an Adlerian, blah, 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 then having established the fact that my friend had fulfilled in a dream his wish to become white, that is, to become a man, to be a man, I would show him that his neurosis, his psychic instability, the rupture of his ego arose out of this governing fiction. And I would say to him, Monsieur Manoni has very ably described this phenomenon in the Malagasy. Look here, I think you simply have to resign yourself to remaining in the place that has been assigned to you. Here he's basically taking the piss out of a common attitude. And then Fanon comes in, he kind of responds to this one option. He says, no, certainly not. I will not say that at all. I will tell him the environment, society are responsible for your delusion. Once that has been said, the rest will follow of itself. And what that is, we know. The end of the world. The end of the world. So there's something that if we end the structures in which Enlightenment structures, we could say after the Frankfurt School, of European racism, of dehumanization, we're not just ending something in one country or in one place. What we're doing actually is we are transforming the fabric of culture, of the wider world. We end that world in which those relations are possible, are viable. What would that mean? Now, just as a brief tangent, it's not common to get this kind of analysis that mental illness is caused by wider society in English-speaking political writings or psychiatric writings. You don't get it very often. Normally it's the individual, it's, your childhood development or something like this. But you do get it in one guy called David Smale. You might know of him already in a work called The Origins of Unhappiness. Now, Smale was an NHS clinical psychologist, and he's working in Nottinghamshire, so he's dealing with lots of patients a lot of the time, like Fanon did. And he says that if we're going to understand people's sense of anxiety or depression or inferiority, we can't just look at those early life experiences, although they really count. We need to not just develop what he calls insight into that person's own life. We need to develop what he calls outsight, awareness of the social relations, the power relations in which some see from the earliest of ages that some are more worthy than others. He calls this the wounds of class, of ancient social class. And how you observe your parents being, humiliated, feeling a sense of shame, and you somehow internalize that this is right and proper, this is the way the world is. And what are the effects of that? Now, Smale is writing about class in Britain in the 80s and 90s, but Fanon is talking about racism in Algeria in the 50s. And here he is, here's the doctor in action. This on the right is, this is probably an image from the 80s or 90s of the hospital in which he worked, Bleeder. So what's happening in Fanon's Algeria? Well, he's thinking about the same structures of inferiority and so on as an effect of colonialism, as we've discussed. Now, he's from Martinique in the Caribbean, but he's working in North Africa. Algeria has been occupied by the French, I think, for over a century. And just after Fanon moves there, it erupts in a war of independence. Now, Algeria is different because not only have you got this kind of like French control of North Africa, you have a religious element too, and the ways in which Islam and being North African also become associated with certain ideals or character traits, and that can end up perpetuating inferiority or not. And Fanon talks about this in an essay called The North African Syndrome of 1952. And he talks about how people are thingified, they're turned into things, they're turned into objects, they're dehumanized. They're dehumanized when we associate repulsive ideas with them. And what the impact of that is for colonialism. Fanon, quote, "This man who you thingify, by calling him systematically Muhammad, whom you reconstruct or rather whom you dissolve on the basis of an idea you know to be repulsive. Well, don't you have the impression that you are emptying him of his substance? They have had France squeezed into them wherever, in their bodies and in their souls, there was room for something apparently great. Now they are told in no uncertain terms that they are in our country." I think this is a really useful way of thinking about some of those arguments from Black Skin, White Mask just earlier. That inferiority also works by being dehumanized, by having your own sources of strength removed. Your substance is emptied. That your identity is to be French, but you're always not going to be good enough French. Your skin is always a bit too dark. You're the wrong religion. You're from the wrong place. You're never going to be good enough, and that's how colonialism perpetuates itself. Interestingly, Fanon makes a critique of Western medical science here, in a way that well-meaning nurses, doctors, you might be trying to improve infant health and mortality, perhaps with religious motivations like the nun here. What they're ultimately doing is kind of humiliating and disempowering local people. Let's look at what he says, and then let's see if we can relate this to what Foucault is saying. This is from a different work. Introduced into Algeria at the same time as racialism and humiliation, Western medical science, being part of the oppressive system, has always provoked in the native an ambivalent attitude. But the colonial situation is precisely such that it drives the colonized to appraise all the colonizers' contributions in a pejorative and absolute way. The colonized perceives the doctor, like Fanon, the engineer, the school teacher, the policeman, the rural constable, through the haze of an almost organic confusion. So I guess in this moment where the colonized peoples are disempowered, their local cultures and government and so on are fragmented and dispersed. Western medicine is seen as part of a system in which Foucault would talk about this later in terms of the idea of discipline. Bodies are disciplined, bodies are controlled, and bodies are placed under the control of a different idea system so that those bodies are confused about what their purpose is. They don't have much agency. They're just moved around from one queue to another. They're moved from one place to another. They're told to fit in, but they're not allowed to fit in. So Fanon says a lot about this, about the almost like the neurotic responses of the colonized. Not neurotic in a bad way, but just as something that involves a kind of resistance to oppression, but it's passive and indirect. Even though both are dependent on each other, the colonizer and the colonized. The colonized depends on the colonizer for government, for overseeing the social structure. And the colonizer depends on the colonizer for all of the wealth that they extract from the place too, and also their own sense of superiority. Both are dependent on each other, even if they are made to be so kind of entirely different. So Fanon sees, when he talks about religion in this way, that religion itself can be a kind of site of resistance to the colonizers, a place that allows resentful behavior. That it's a place where the colonized people can resist and have different values. They can resist with their values, with their clothing. It can be a kind of defense. Not much, but it's something. Is it enough? Well, Fanon, you'll see this with the reading, isn't just about celebrating indigenous cultures. There has to be something way more systematic and way more violent if society is going to change. To escape from a condition of passivity, escape from a condition of being dictated to, of having someone else think your thoughts. What Fanon wants, what he's driving for, is national liberation as a form of therapy. It's going to involve a form of collective madness. Madness of a different sort. It's interesting. This is an interesting remark that Fanon says here. I'm going to quote from a letter that he gives to the resident minister. It's collected in this essay collection called Toward the African Revolution. And he says that madness, quote, madness is one of the means man has of losing his freedom. It's a form of escapism. You leave, you depart, you're no longer present in a terrifying and oppressive social situation. And maybe that's what Fanon was saying in his work. People that had gone mad as a form of escapism from the violence of the country. But Fanon says that, he's already seeing, there is a kind of collective neurosis among many people that he sees already. Quote, the degree of alienation of the inhabitants of this country appears to me frightening. Now, if particularly North Africans are mentally unwell because of colonialism, the goal then is a kind of therapy which involves a repersonalization, a rehumanization, becoming human again, becoming conscious, becoming sovereign. And this is where psychiatry could be really political. That's what Fanon thinks. Quote, if psychiatry is the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. So the goal then is repersonalization, to become human. That's what's at stake here. That's why, in a certain sense, The Wretched of the Earth should really be seen as a philosophical book, not just a product of its time. Okay, right, let's get into the arguments of the book. So, we know that it comes out in 1961. It reflects Fanon's thinking over the late 1950s as he's supporting the exiled National Liberation Front. It reflects his journalism, and it's a kind of statement to the world of what they're trying to achieve. He's also very sick when he's writing it, so maybe it certainly begins sort of more coherent, more structured, and then it loses that over time. And that's kind of why I wanted to look at the beginning of the book as well. It's more forthright. So the context is war. A war in which maybe what Fanon was talking about necessity of is starting to come about. Pride, collective strength, resistance to French culture, demands for self-determination, for establishing a new Algerian culture which isn't just specifically French, isn't white French. That's what's happening. It could go many ways. We might want to have this in mind when we were talking about Foucault last week in person. We talked about the situation with Iran. Foucault, yes, he might have been very naive in not understanding what was about to happen there, but it kind of reflects this sort of belief that the anti-colonial movements, because they were ultimately driven by a desire for human liberation, that they were intrinsically progressive, and that even socialism would, it would be the next step following getting rid of the colonial government. Now, this very rarely happens, but that was the belief. They didn't know. Now let's think about what they're getting to with this. So the context is Algeria trying to overthrow Charles de Gaulle. Now we know from Fanon's earlier work, the premise is that colonization is based on the dehumanization of the colonized. It's not about political power, it's about psychological control, cultural control. So what Fanon sets out here is how colonization works in different ways. There is the whole police violence, but it can also be kind of different. It can be even in the organization of cities into different quarters, spatial control. Fanon here draws on Charles de Gaulle and the way that Charles de Gaulle and the French had deliberately kind of separated the colonized cities into the colonial quarters, which are very well kept and very tidy, versus the deliberately dilapidated, very poor, underdeveloped shanty town of the local people. De Gaulle describes them as the yellow multitudes. They're like animals, they're swarming. So the colonizer needs to do this. This is part of, communicating and perpetuating inferiority and shame. It's deep. And how that then becomes reproduced. It's not about police violence. It's about culture and ideas. Now, how do the colonized stay in power? Who's going to do a lot of the day-to-day work? It isn't always French bureaucrats. It still involved the kind of consent among some local elite. Not always, and they don't deserve the blame for what happened. But there would be kind of local religious leaders or people in the kind of middle class of those countries that in some ways kind of propped up the regimes indirectly, unwittingly. So Fanon is very critical of the bourgeoisie, of the cultural or the economic upper class, who are used by the colonizer. And his concern is that they were going to stay behind after national liberation, and they would just kind of reproduce colonialism. They would act like the French long after the French had gone. And this maybe there's some things that he has to say that are prophetic. But where you have the white European colonizer and you have the kind of the collaborators, then ultimately what the net effect of that is that the people there are used to viewing themselves as inferior, and they develop what Fanon calls, not here but somewhere else, self-hatred. And I think this is just interesting, like just as an aside, you get this a lot in the writings of James Baldwin in America, when he talks about how racism worked. Why didn't black Americans challenge racism more often? And he talks about the power of fear and of self-hatred, of thinking that you didn't have the power, you were not worthy enough to challenge segregation. You didn't have. You couldn't do anything about structural racism, about police racism. Maybe that's what's always made such violent protests on the streets so empowering, like the stuff around George Floyd right now. It's a rebuke against that self-hatred. Now, this is quite a startling image, and it comes from a series of photographs taken during the War of Independence, in which it's French photographers with these French soldiers. Normally these local women would be dressed in a lot of veils, and they were forcibly stripped, so in order to get their pictures of their faces taken, because they were suspected of potentially being resistance fighters and so on. And it's the ways in which photography is more than just an image. Here there's something. This is about shame ultimately. But shame only works if you are willing, well, not if it only works, but Shame can be challenged when somebody looks back, when somebody stares back, when somebody refuses to be made inferior, and instead, kind of challenges the colonial viewer with the glare of their humanity. I think maybe there's something like that in this image here. What Fanon is trying to challenge in The Wretched of the Earth is the dehumanization of the Algerians and how to rehumanize them again. Quote, what is the status of Algeria? A systematized dehumanization. It was an absurd gamble to undertake at whatever cost, to bring into existence a certain number of values when the lawlessness, the inequality, the multi-daily murder of man were raised to the status of legislative principles. The social structure existing in Algeria was hostile to any attempt to put the individual back where he belonged. Fanon's saying that there's nothing we can do with the existing colonial structure of Algeria. We can't just change one small part of its government because it's already dehumanized everybody. It's already lawless. It's already unequal. It's already so violent. That reflects the colonial order. We cannot do anything with it. It's rotten. We must overthrow it. We must burn it down and build anew. That's part of the fiery energy. That's part of the drive to overthrow in this work. And it's powerful. It's startling. We get this even from the very beginning of this book. That decolonization isn't an easy process. It's not nice, and it's certainly not going to be peaceful. It has to involve confrontation. It has to kind of powerfully challenge the ways in which the colonial subject has been made. They're a product they've been made to feel inferior, unequal. And its goal has to be creating a new humanity. I've set out some questions here on the slide that you could think about. It's interesting. The philosophical aim of this book on a certain level is to create a new humanity, to become man again. What does that mean for the white French? Well, one thing that's interesting historically about this book, The Wretched of the Earth, is the long preface by Jean-Paul Sartre. The major figure, the major public intellectual in French life at this time, a Marxist, a key figure in existentialism. Writes this preface where basically it's kind of slightly self-pitying, I think, but he talks so easily. He says, "Yeah, this guy Fanon is right. There needs to be violence." He does sometimes describe this in quite a patronising way. That this kind of almost like bestial violence of the colonised is a necessary purge of their, it's their collective will, because these savages have been subjective for so long. Maybe I'm being harsh here. You make your own mind up on this. Let me just give you the passages. Sartre. Read Fanon. You'll see that in a time of helplessness, murderous rampage is the collective unconscious of the colonised. He's also a little bit apologetic about why a white intellectual needs to give a preface in order to sell a book by a black intellectual. Because says, the book doesn't need a preface. And then he also says, the book isn't written for people like us. Well, it is really. It's a book that's written for the international stage. It's written for the white French. It's an articulation of why the Algerians are fighting, and it's also a kind of manifesto for similar independence movements elsewhere. Sartre says that it is not addressed to us. But then he makes a very interesting point, and we'll try and come back to this in a couple of weeks' time when we look at Deleuze and Guattari. That colonization is something that isn't just something that affects the colonized, it affects the colonized too. Quote, we too, peoples of Europe, we are being decolonized, meaning the colonist inside every one of us is surgically extracted in a bloody operation. Now, there are a lot of references in Sartre's preface to the violence of the struggle in Algeria. And I think, this violence might already be making us feel a bit uneasy, for people being kidnapped or many people being murdered, bombs going off to achieve national liberation. Is that always going to work? Or does violence simply only beget further violence? So Camus disagreed with Sartre on this. Camus was against he would not, he's born in Algeria, although his heritage is Pied Noir, it's white French, but he refuses to kind of say it's acceptable for violence isn't acceptable here, even if it achieves national liberation. And he gives the example of his mum. His mum still lives in Algeria. She uses public transport. One of these bombs might blow her up. Camus, quote, "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." So Camus ends up falling out of fashion for a bit because he's advocating kind of more centrist third way compromise, where of dialogue, of non-violent action. He's very much against terrorism. I think history looks well on Camus' response rather than Sartre's. But it's this problem of what you do if you are already subject to violent oppression. There's already violence there. You're already being locked up. You're already being murdered. You're being drowned in the River Seine. The violence already exists. So when you fight back, you're not injecting new violence. You're simply responding to the violence that's already there. Now in France, there isn't really that much awareness of what's happening in Algeria. There's widespread torture, but the French press censors it all, so people don't really know how bad it is there. And then in 1958, the government in France collapses because of the Algerian War, because you have a group of French generals who basically threaten to overthrow the entire government, and they kind of do that. They overthrow the government in Algiers. They occupy the island of Corsica, and they basically say that there's going to be a coup in France in 1958 unless Charles de Gaulle is installed. That's kind of like a coup anyway, isn't it? But de Gaulle is already an important political figure. And so this is the end of the Fourth Republic. That's why when we say France, it's the Fifth Republic. What happens to the early republics? The Fourth Republic ends in 58 because of a military coup, effectively, because of the Algerian War. This is really violent. Sartre's flat is bombed several times. So is the office of the newspaper that he edits, Modern Times. So this, it's not just that Fanon is kind of, an armchair revolutionary bringing in violence when nobody wants it. There's already a hell of a lot of violence here already. So keep this in mind when you're reading on violence. It's such a fiery beginning of a book. Keep that in mind too when you think about the way that Fanon critiques the bourgeois intellectuals. What Fanon doesn't want to see is just simply changing, getting rid of white colonial governors and having brown-skinned upper-class people there instead. Power is more than just having a local person there. The problem is the bourgeois colonized intellectuals. They always talk about moderation. They don't really want to change the status quo because they've grown up having a lot of power within it. So Fanon is wary of that. Just as he's very wary of the colonizer, he's also wary of the forms of compromise that aren't really going to perpetuate the same sources of violence, of tyranny that had existed under the French before. So he kind of makes these gestures in places about collective power, collective thinking. We can't have elites here. There needs to be something democratic. It's a democratic raising up. It's an empowerment of the people to think for themselves, to become human again. And so on and so on. So what does that mean then? What does it mean to cure the colonized from their mental pathologies of colonization? Well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? National liberation as collective therapy and what that might mean. And what the, the kind of psychotherapeutic equivalence of violence is in that respect. A struggle, I suppose, against repression. Repression like we saw in the Frankfurt School, the way in which we repress our desires in order to keep on working and being productive, as Marcuse talked about. Here instead there must be the creation of new forms of authority. And that's hard. Fanon also talks about how many people might be resistant to this because they've had because they've been led to feel inferior, because they've been bribed by bread and circuses. And the Frankfurt School have this running critique of popular culture and consumerism. Fanon points out this kind of makes these melancholy notes as well. Quote, "The militant sometimes has the grueling impression he has to drag his people back, up from the pit and out of the cave. The militant very often realizes that not only must he hunt down the enemy forces, but also the core of despair crystallized in the body of the colonized." Now the cave, I want you to think of Plato's cave, the analogy of the cave in the Republic. And the people don't know what the source of their illusions is, the shadow play inside the cave. They need to climb out and see. But in Plato's analogy of the cave, nobody wants to leave the cave except for the truth-seeking philosopher. And then when the philosopher leaves and when they come back, the people in the cave attack and kill them because they see them as somebody who is completely mad. What do we do with that? Well, we've made these nods already to the influence of the master-slave struggle from hate. That in the struggle for colonial liberation is a struggle to become human and to be recognized again. That you cannot be recognized unless there is struggle in the first place. That you are not going to end colonial rule simply by creating petitions or simply by accepting that the French are ultimately benign and thinking about things change in terms of a 20, 30 year time frame. It has to be much sooner, it has to be much more direct. Because what we're trying to create, no less, is a new man. Quote, when the nation in its totality is set in motion, the new man is not an a posteriori, like an after the fact, creation of this nation, but coexists with it, matures with it, and triumphs with it. Independence is not a magic ritual, but an indispensable condition for men and women to exist in true liberation. In other words, to master all the material resources necessary for a radical transformation of society. So these are the stakes. They're huge and wide. It's not about just changing the government. It's about creating a new form of humanity across the world. A radical transformation of society for men, for women, for all, not just for the elites, not just for the intellectuals. It can only be paid for by a force of violence, but not violence for its own sake, but something that burns away the old colonial culture in which these codes, these linguistic and cultural codes of inferiority exist. Maybe a tantalizing thing to think about here is the ways in which oppression, discrimination and self-hatred work in all sorts of other ways. Now, for those of us that still dream in a visionary way of changing the social order completely in a post-capitalist direction, what new codes we would need to establish, what a repersonalization would mean today, what it would mean to become human today. However, instead we are still falling prey to the same utopias and daydreams of past ages, and maybe which colour somewhat Fanon's dream of the revolutionary horizon. Okay, let's talk about legacies. So what happened in Algeria? It was all fine, wasn't it? You know, nowadays it's a modern socialist republic, isn't it? No, it's not. So, 1962, Algeria gains independence after a long violent struggle. There's lots of massacres. There's massacres of the local French people there afterwards. There was a huge influx of refugees, of Pieds Noirs, from Algeria to France. We're going to meet one of them next week, Jacques Derrida. Well, he's Jewish, and the whole Jewish Pieds Noirs, it's getting more and more complicated here. So the FLN, the National Liberation Front, are in power. They are led by a charismatic figurehead who becomes more despotic over time, corrupts more and more of the political process, very willing to use the same violence that they used against the French, against his opponents. Is very willing to use a narrative of a collective will, this time through Islam, in order to oppress dissidents. In the end, the FLN is overthrown in the 1990s by the Islamist opposition. And Algeria basically, and this is a common story among lots of countries that were colonized, begins by being led by very kind of radical intellectuals who either die or are assassinated quite early on, and ends up becoming a kind of very poor democracy, if not a corrupt dictatorship, characterized by underdevelopment and poverty. Probably not much worse than what existed under the French, but certainly not the kind of national liberation that Fanon and many others had imagined. There's a good book about Fanon by a guy called Leo Zelig, called Fanon, the Militant Philosopher. And he talks about when he was teaching in Senegal, And it's interesting because Senegal, Western Africa, it's colonized by the French, and he wants to teach his students about Fanon and about national liberation, third world liberation. But the students are very pessimistic about it, and they kind of think it's not going to work, it's off its time. Fanon is completely wrong. And Selig, who's a white writer, is trying to understand why nowadays we have this kind of narrative, not just of the failure of Fanon or that kind of romantic revolutionary spirit, but also about what happened to colonized countries afterwards. Selig, I'll quote: Fanon had believed decolonization and national liberation would demystify racial oppression and re-cerebralize, I better put that up, re-cerebralize, provide a brain, provide thought, re-cerebralize the poor and colonized subject. These processes, he thought, would lead to full mutual self-recognition. Instead, the failure of independence seemed to confirm for my students the truth of the racist myths of stupidity and backwardness. Even Stuart Hall, very interesting Jamaican British intellectual, key figure of British New Left in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, major figure in cultural studies, says that Fanon, product of its time. Maybe. I guess many philosophers are products of their time, but we call something a product of its time because it's no longer relevant to our time. Is that so? How are we now in a world in which racial inferiority is a product of colonial education, or slavery doesn't exist anymore? You tell me. As an aside, somebody was doing some research on the IRA library that was in the Maze prison in Northern Ireland. This kind of secret collection of books that were lent out to the many IRA prisoners there. Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, was a very popular book in this series. You just looked this up on The Guardian, a lot of stuff there. Lenin was by far the most popular, but Fanon still has this kind of interesting kind of life and legacy in Irish Republican thought. All right, so let's think about the legacies of Fanon, at least within its own time. This is a major and important text for the third world political movements of the 1960s. When I say third world, I don't mean it in a pejorative way. I mean it in a move among countries, particularly in Africa, to become a third world, become a power bloc that was independent of the First World, America, the Cold War, or the Second World, the Soviet Union and China. That was the aim. Doesn't quite work out. But there's still legacy still there and stuff like the African Union. This is a book that is influential for anti-colonial struggles in the United States, in Ireland, like I mentioned, in Vietnam, Palestine, Yasser Arafat. I guess what we see here is that how power operates at a psychological level. We see that in Foucault. We can see it in Deleuze and Guattari later. And then there's a question mark hovering over all of this. Donald Trump, shithole countries, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. The ways in which formerly colonized countries are still systematically poor and underdeveloped and produce cash crops. Maybe if Fanon was around, he would say that the problems that the bourgeois elites had ultimately stayed in power, that there hadn't been a full and real democratic transformation at all. They still retained the vestiges of colonial thought. The question, how might Fanon challenge us to interrogate the present? Okay, we're going to discuss all this when we next meet on Monday. I've got a few questions for us. We want to get into this one first. How does Fanon argue that colonialism dehumanizes the colonized? How does dehumanization work? And then what's the colonized supposed to do about it? So I want you to think here about all the remarks about violence. But what exactly does he mean? How do you place Fanon in his various contexts? Colonialism in Martinique in the Second World War. Him as an active and successful psychiatrist in the 50s. Merleau-Ponty is taught by him, phenomenology and so forth. How do we place Fanon in different places? And then, does it apply today? To what extent? I think it might. Okay, we meet again Monday, 8th June. And so for the following week, I thought it was going to be Derrida, but it's Jacques Lacan. So what we're going to look at is the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Seminar 7, and the final chapter of this. This is all about the philosophy of desire. This is what we're going to look at. I'm going to give you an interview as well. Lacan, it's got a fiendish reputation, it says how he writes, but we're going to look at some fairly clear and not too lengthy bits. We're going to fit him in to our survey of language in this period. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and we'll speak on Monday.